Hello, welcome to the launch of the Regional Regulatory Forecast. This is the first ever deep dive into how ready the digital industry is for the regulations that are accelerating across the region. My name's Miranda. I'm the CEO of IAB Southeast Asia and India, and we hope that by the end of this webinar, you'll see regulations exactly the same way as we do, not just as laws to comply with, but as a culture and commercial advantage. What we've seen over the past decade is that every market has been steadily adding regulations. What's changed, though, is the speed at which these are being enacted. Our region's in the most active period of regulatory development as laws are catching up with innovation, with transformation, with technology. And all 7 markets in this study are introducing increased AI governance this year, which will apply alongside the privacy, e-commerce, advertising, and cybersecurity policies that are already in place. And in some cases, they're even going to change them. At the same time, enforcement is also increasing, with penalties ranging from criminal prosecution to fines of up to 10% of annual turnover. And so what this report will give you is a mirror and a method. You'll be able to compare where your company stands, how to support your teams in applying them to their roles, and also how to inform regulations as they're being drafted. And we're also going to give you a plan to help you strengthen across all 3 of these areas. None of this would have been possible without a research grant from Google, and we're incredibly grateful for their support and also their trust for giving us full independence in everything you're going to see today. For now, I'm going to hand over to Andy, our Strategic Director, to take you through the findings.
Okay, thank you, Miranda. So what I do now is, over the next 45 minutes, is to give you some top-line learnings from the research we've done. And my intention is to help you see regulations as something that needs to be loved, that are an opportunity that gives you a business edge. These are not regulations that are seen as a risk to your business, but something that can help you in your day-to-day. And the learnings we've got from speaking to many different companies are that there are essentially 3 simple steps you can take to be better prepared for the regulations that are not only happening today, but also the ones that are taking place in the future. So the information we've collected from this has come from a large sample base of people we've spoken to around the region. To give you an idea of that, we managed to speak to over 1,700 people across a number of different companies related to the advertising and digital advertising industry, from e-commerce companies to platforms to agencies to brands, across representing pretty much every market in the region and from people at a very senior level. We spoke to these people about how regulations were managed in their company, their existing awareness and understanding of specific laws that are related to their industry and market, as well as their opinions on what would make them better prepared for the new wave of regulation that we're seeing coming through in the future. And just an aside here, we actually got such an amazing response here. So I've been working in research for the last 25 years, and I was blown away by the number of responses we got here, specifically on a survey about regulation. So thank you for everybody who's listening to this, who actually attended and joined those surveys. Your input's been very, very helpful, and we thank you for that. To start with, though, as we go through the learnings today, I want to share with you a paradox we saw, a tension we saw in the industry about the application and understanding of regulatory practices. And that can be summarized here. So each of these dots essentially represents some of our respondents. And what we asked here was, how prepared do you think your company is to regulations that exist today? And the responses we got essentially said that most people felt their company was well prepared for regulations. So we believe that our business is well prepared for regulations that are taking place today and has got processes in place that will help prepare for regulations in the future. Great. In that case, we may not need to do this webinar, and in fact, we may not need to explore too much of the survey. But in fact, when we started digging deeper into this and asking people, so you may think your company's prepared, but do you understand regulations? Less than half of people then said, well, actually, yes. Although I think my company's prepared, I don't really understand it too much myself. And in fact, I'm not that aware of the regulations that affect my role today. And this is the paradox we're talking about. The paradox that says we believe that somebody else is in charge of this, but actually I don't really understand it myself. So less than half of people said they're aware of the regulations impacting their roles. When we went into this even further and dug even deeper, we asked people whose job it is to understand regulations. Fully 20% of those people said that they understood. So 80% of the people who said that they were in charge of regulations had enough information to actually make decisions. So although awareness is relatively low amongst people, understanding was lower even further. So 80% of the people who said they were aware said they didn't even understand enough of those regulations to make a decision and fully understood the implications of those policies. And this leads us to a situation where the paradox is, I believe that somebody else is worrying about this, but I don't need to. And as a result, nobody's worried about it or nobody's prepared as much as they should be. And I think our favorite cartoon dog is the best description of the situation we might find ourselves in today. It's fine. I believe that somebody else is concerned and on top of this, therefore I don't need to be. And the reality is that if everybody's not on top of it, then the risk is that nobody is. And the risk is that we're opening ourselves up to risk in the business from not understanding these regulations enough. So why should we care about this? And why should we care personally about regulation? Firstly, at the moment, many regulations, in all honesty, are only there as guidance. Enforcement is currently unclear. But actually, what's coming through in the regulations that are coming through at the moment and are passing through governments as we speak are getting much more into enforcement. There's going to be much more emphasis in upcoming regulations that actually there's risks of fines and there's risks of other penalties taking place as well. For example, one of the more recent regulations coming through is the use of AI in advertising and content. In February of this year, India pushed through a law at the same time roughly as Europe as well, actually by coincidence, that says that any AI generated content needs to be labeled as such. And in fact, needs to be taken down within 3 hours if it violates that regulation.
And Andy, this labelling is only the first piece of a wider framework India is building under their AI governance guidelines. And as I mentioned earlier, what is astounding is the speed we're seeing new laws come into play. India's data protection law has taken quite a few years to come into effect, but these AI rules arrived within weeks. Look, of course, the two differ in scope, but the point is really how quickly AI regulation is being developed as a priority. And this is another reason to really be ready to respond to opportunities to inform them, but also to make sure that your business is prepared for what they mean.
And these, specifically the AI labeling law, has a huge impact on how consumers respond to brands. So, for example, there's been a lot of research taking place that suggests that as soon as a consumer sees or recognizes an advert as being AI generated, the trust in the brand that advert is advertising drops significantly. So in many cases, we're passively waiting for regulations to come into effect that actually may have a really significant impact on the work that we do day to day. And if we've been involved earlier in the discussions maybe on those AI labeling laws, then actually might be able to affect them more for the future. So the challenge is, not only is there a reason to care, do we care enough to be involved and get engaged with these regulations as they take place? So this is therefore unsurprising to notice when we ask people about whether they think regulations are a risk or an opportunity, we start seeing that most people see regulation at the moment as a significant risk to their business. So what this slide shows is those people who we ask them, do you see regulation as a risk or an opportunity? Most people we spoke to, around about 70% of people, said that they didn't really see a difference. They were unsure. They saw the regulation, it could be a risk, it could be an opportunity, I don't really know. They had no strong opinion on it, which shows a challenge to start with. A lot of people may not know enough about the regulations to make a decision about whether they see them as a risk or an opportunity. But those people who do have an opinion, they skewed significantly and heavily towards risk. And this occurred across pretty much every type of company, apart from publishers, where we're a bit more skewed towards opportunity. So for example, the way of reading this is, if I look at the all line, we're saying that 20% of everybody we spoke to said they predominantly saw regulations as a risk, only 9% saw regulation as a potential opportunity. And it's this group of people, the people who see regulation as an opportunity, we'd actually like to learn from. So if we're going to learn to love regulation, we should learn to understand why the people who see it as an opportunity see regulation as something they should love and look out for. So again, we spoke to these people in more detail about why do you see regulation as an opportunity for your business and your day-to-day? And their responses came back in broadly one of two spaces. By far the most common response was, I see understanding regulation as something that gives me greater trust and credibility with my customer and my client. And it gives me a differentiation versus other companies in my space when I may be pitching for business. Being seen to understand and be on top of regulations that affect day-to-day decisions in my particular area mark me as somebody credible and somebody trustworthy. And that has a direct impact on my ability to win business and grow a relationship and partnership with a customer. The smaller group of people came back and said, we just see this as a way of getting market access and requirements, as a way of getting in. But again, everybody who came back and said regulation is an opportunity saw it as something that was a business opportunity, something that actually will impact the bottom line for a company. So it's not just something that the legal teams need to worry about, it's something that our sales teams, our go-to-market teams, and our partnership teams all need to be fully aware of. Because if you are on top of regulations, that'll help you do your job, and your day-to-day will work much better. And to demonstrate this, a couple of really great quotes we got from people, firstly from a partner in Malaysia, and secondly here from an agency in Indonesia. Both of them said roughly the same thing. And we saw this across all the verbatims and written feedback we got from people when we asked this question. Essentially, understanding regulation and compliance, for example, is seen as table stakes in many RFPs now. It is expected that I understand what regulations are about. And in fact, being able to demonstrate this more than anybody else helps me win business. Being seen to understand regulations enables me to win business over my competition. So it has a real commercial impact, not just a legal risk impact. And so the other main aim of the research we had was to understand, well, great, what makes those companies who are better prepared for regulations work better than companies who are maybe not? What are those guys doing better than companies that are not as well prepared for regulations? And essentially it came down to three things that the most prepared companies were doing better than others. And firstly, they were assigning responsibility to somebody based in our region, within Southeast Asia, India. They had somebody whose job it was to understand regulations, and they were responsible for communicating that to the rest of the business. They weren't outsourcing it to a central location or a centralized business unit. It was being managed and worked on within this region. The second thing we saw them doing was developing guidance. It wasn't just about understanding, being aware of regulations. It's about saying, how do I make that regulation meaningful for people in this business who need to make decisions on those? And I'll go into this in a bit more detail a bit later on. And the third thing we see those companies doing more effectively is engaging early with policymakers. They weren't waiting for regulations to happen. They were actively engaged in the design and the feedback and engaging with policymakers on how those regulations were being designed and made. And what we're going to do now for the rest of the session is go into each of these in a little bit more detail to give you more information about how you can actually activate on each of these. So let's start with assigning in-market responsibility and what that means. And essentially, this is all about how do I have people who I know sit in my region, who I can speak to, who can help me understand how these regulations work, and whose job it is to be on top of regulation and guidance. And a couple of data points that stood out for us when we were looking into this give a size of the potential challenge we might be facing. Firstly, 35% of people we spoke to in our survey said they actually had no idea who to speak to. They didn't know who they could connect to internally, if they had anyone to connect to at all. So a large proportion of people simply didn't know who to speak to. And even amongst those people who said they did know who to speak to, fully 64% of those said that that person sat outside the Southeast Asia region. They're in a centralized location, maybe a few time zones away. They were not engaged in the business day-to-day at that level. They were seen as potentially a distant person to connect with.
Well, also what we saw here is almost 40% of companies don't even have a single person responsible. Currently, that responsibility is shared across different people, across different functions. So perhaps it might be legal and leadership or leadership and tech. And we've seen that having a dedicated legal or compliance role, especially when we're based in this region, really isn't common.
But it does make a huge impact to how these companies operate and how prepared they are for regulation and guidance. In fact, it can be summarized quite nicely in this slide. If you have people based in the region, we found that companies who had that, the people within those companies were twice as likely to be involved in submitting formal feedback to governments and getting involved in the creation and management of those regulations. Having somebody in the region also meant that the people involved in the company in the region were also twice as confident in applying guidance, and they were twice aware of regulations that impacted their roles. So having somebody simply based in the region whose job it is had a huge multiplier effect on the preparedness of the rest of the organization to apply, understand, and engage in regulation processes in those markets.
Well, what we've seen is because each market in this region are all at different stages of digital and regulatory maturity, adding that tyranny of distance really does reduce your company's ability to inform what's developing, but also to empower your teams with the knowledge that they need to make daily business decisions in the markets that are affected.
And what's interesting when you look at this in more details, people who are not necessarily aware and not getting that level of support, they're going to lots of different spaces or certain areas for information on regulation. There's still a hunger to understand what's happening in regulation. And so when we start looking at where people go for information about regulations that affect them in their role, it's quite interesting to look at this by people who are very aware of the regulations that affect them, as well as people who are not necessarily that aware of regulations. And what's interesting here is that firstly, the most common source of information for pretty much everybody was accessing news and media coverage. But it comes even more important for those people who necessarily don't have somebody locally in their markets and have general low awareness of the regulations that affect their role. They're even more likely to rely on news and media coverage for that information. And this is important because information you may get from news and media will tell you what the regulation may be about, but it won't necessarily connect it to your day-to-day or to your business needs. Companies who are highly aware and people who are highly aware of regulations worked with a wide number of different sources of information, both externally through platforms and partner updates, industry associations, external legal counsels, for example, as well as their internal legal and policy teams. The people who are very low awareness were predominantly looking for information from, again, news and media, and maybe looking out for guidance from global updates, but they didn't have the support locally, and they didn't necessarily go out to external partners for support either. And that means that there's not only an awareness gap, there's going to be an understanding and application gap. And this pattern was seen across pretty much every company we spoke to, with the exception of one, and that was the advertisers. So when we started speaking to brands and advertising companies about how they understood regulation, they had a very different perspective on where they got information from. And they predominantly relied on external partners far more than internal. Advertisers are looking for support from their partners in the industry and platforms they work with, looking for guidance from industry associations. They're going externally out to the industry to help them understand and rely on the external industry to apply the regulations to their business.
When we dug a little bit deeper here and we cut the data by just the highly aware advertisers, we can see that they use industry associations at 3.5 times the rate of those with limited awareness. And this actually aligns almost perfectly with our own content consumption trends for the tools and the guidelines and the frameworks that we publish. We have a highly engaged advertiser audience who trust us.
And this really drives home the point that, especially if you're a service provider, that being clear on the role that regulation plays in your industry is a critical deciding factor in competitive pitches, especially with advertisers. So I hope we've made the point now that having somebody local and somebody engaged in the region whose job it is to look at regulation and interpreting those laws is an important differentiating factor. And once you've got that role assigned, then actually the next two pillars we're going to talk to in a minute are much easier to execute. And those two pillars are around about developing guidance that connects regulation to business decisions. And then lastly, engaging with policymakers in that market or region as the regulation is being developed. These become much simpler to execute if you have somebody in the region who's close to it and close to those developments. So let's go into each of these lastly in turn now, starting with developing regional guidance. And really the challenge here is, how do I take information that's been prepared in a regulation in potentially quite legal language and connect that to an individual's role? The message we're going to get across here is it's not just the legal team's department's role to do this. This is something that's owned and should be loved by everybody in the business. It's everyone's responsibility to understand regulations, not just your legal teams. And this comes through again in a couple of really nice quotes we got from the people we spoke to. And in both cases here, for the brand in India and the partner in the Philippines, the feedback we got was, yes, we rely a lot on our legal teams and our law firms to give us information, but the challenge is making it relevant for my day-to-day, making it relevant for decisions I need to make in my particular role. A law firm can tell me a lot about the regulations that affect me, but how do they impact how I run a programmatic campaign? How do they tell me if my audience segments are compliant? And that level of detail, and be able to translate a legal document and legal language into something that's business friendly and user friendly, is a critical gap we're seeing as well, that can be answered again by having somebody based in the market. And in fact, almost half of the people we spoke to found it a challenge in finding and understanding regulations in a language they could actually use. And this is one of the biggest things that came out. We understand there's regulations out there. I'm aware a regulation exists, but I don't understand it enough to be able to apply it correctly or have confidence in applying correctly in my day-to-day, because the language it's written in is difficult for me to understand or translate to my day-to-day. And so the number one request we got from everyone we spoke to, regardless of whether they're an existing company who had well prepared for the future or a company that was relatively unprepared, the number one request from both cases was this idea that I need to have timely region and role specific guidance that connects regulations and the language used in those regulations clearly to how I make my business decisions. Timely, because as Miranda's been saying, we're seeing a lot more regulation coming through and faster. Region specific, because in many cases, the people looking at regulation are actually based outside the region and are looking at many different markets. And already Southeast Asia, India is a very complex region already. So having somebody based here looking at this is critical. And lastly, role specific in terms of translating this for a particular role I have. So having this kind of support is critical in helping prepared companies do better, and was a number one request for unprepared companies about what they want to do in the future to be more prepared.
And while we saw this be the number one ask, it was like the number one ask, particularly for brands and e-commerce retailers, because both of these company types are most likely to have their legal teams be part of a global function based outside of this region. And so they rank having someone in the region who can help them with this translation and with this sort of custom guidance as their biggest ask at a higher rate than the other company types. And I wonder if this is related to both of these company types also being quite dependent on external sources outside of their company as a source of information.
Exactly. So tying back to this idea that regulation understanding is important competitive differentiation for me as well. So moving on to the last part, we're looking here at this idea that engaging early with policymakers is the third pillar of success for businesses that are better prepared for regulation in the future. And what we mean by here, this is an idea that not only are we waiting for policies and regulations to affect us, but actually we are engaging in the process of designing and giving feedback on those regulations in the future. So we're shaping them. So are we shaping the future? Or are we waiting for the future and those regulations to affect us? And actually, this is where we feel there's the biggest opportunity and the biggest reason to potentially have somebody based in this region. Because when we spoke to all the companies that we engage with, the one thing that came out clearly was in the majority of cases, almost half the companies are telling us that we worry about these things once the regulations are implemented and that our company is then accountable. About 12% of companies said to us that actually we only really worry about this when we have an enforcement potentially against us. Relatively few companies and businesses engaged early in the process, either during the drafting phase or when formal feedback submissions are requested by authorities and by regulators. And increasing engagement in this feedback process also has an effect of changing the culture in a business. If I'm engaged in regulations and discussing with governments, that culture that I have of engagement rolls onto the rest of the business. We find that more people understand the regulations that are out there, and more people are aware of the regulations that affect their roles as well.
Well, and also where respondents are aware that their company has submitted formal feedback, partners account for an overwhelmingly larger share than in the overall respondent base. So what this means is that agencies, publishers, brands, and e-commerce are all underrepresented at the moment in formal feedback. But also, yes, what we're seeing is that partners who already have the largest share of voice in formal submissions also want more industry voices represented during the drafting phase. They want what is being developed to be informed by more companies who are going to be affected by what is being developed.
But there's also some other reasons why maybe companies are not necessarily involved in these stages as well. We did ask, are you aware of these feedback loops that come through from regulators in each market? And what was interesting was when we asked, and here we're looking at different markets in the region, on average, only about 50% of people were aware there was even a formal feedback process involved anyway. So firstly, there's an awareness challenge of there being formal feedback available. And even within those people who are aware, less than a quarter of those were of the understanding they'd actually submitted any feedback in the past anyway. So there's an awareness gap of there being a feedback process and being able to engage with governments on regulation, as well as an execution gap of even if I'm aware, I'm not actually getting involved anyway. So why does this gap exist anyway? I think, again, we go back to the quotes we got from the people who responded to our questionnaire, and that is coming from a publisher again in the Philippines, essentially saying, look, we would love to participate in formal feedback if somebody managed it. We ourselves do not have the bandwidth or the connections to get involved in these processes. In short, we don't have the resource, we don't have the connections, we don't have the time, and therefore we don't have the engagement in the process. So this again comes back to where do we go for support on managing regulations and processes? Is it something we can do internally, or how do we potentially work externally on this as well? On a positive side, we did ask people and companies whether they expected there to be increased investment. And fully 2/3 of the businesses we spoke to said that actually we recognize the fact that regulation is important for us, and we are increasing investment in resource allocation for readiness over the next 12 months, or in this case, over 2026. But obviously the question is, how is that resource allocation going to work? Is that going to be in terms of additional investments internally in people, in terms of what activations is that investment going to be made into? And we go back to, again, what we said at the start, the investment should be made in these 3 areas: assigning responsibility to somebody who actually has responsibility for the region. That person can then start developing guidance, educate people, ensure that regulation is meaningful for the people who make those business decisions. And they can engage early with policymakers in those markets as well and shape the future of the policies and regulations, as opposed to simply following and passively following those regulations. But obviously this can be managed in a couple of ways. It can be something that's done internally, but I'd also like to talk to you about the idea of how do we come together as a collective industry to work on this. And this, we want to finish our session today on the importance of a collective industry engagement in addition to work that individual companies will be doing by themselves. Because we do believe that it is important to consider industry engagement now. And as a group, we can work together, because in many cases, the same challenges that you're facing in your company, your peers and competitors are also facing in the broader industry. So if we can come together, we can maybe work together more effectively on this kind of challenge. And we believe there's already a desire for this. So one of the other questions we did ask our respondents was, for newer regulations, specifically around the AI and new technology spaces, where do you go for information for some of these newer regulations that are taking place? And we showed you before already that in many cases, news and media coverage is by far the first point of contact for people. But after that, it's the industry associations, those neutral third parties that come in as a trusted source of information about some of the newer regulations that are taking place. So already industry associations and collective understanding is where people would go through as a next step potentially. And when we speak to people about would they be willing to be involved in these collective discussions, we found that there's actually a strong appetite. So when we asked everyone we spoke to in this part of the survey, we said, would you be willing to be involved in some sort of collective industry forums or collective industry progress on understanding and engaging with regulation? The majority of people said, yes, I would love to be involved. If not me, then actually somebody else I know would be involved as well. So there's already a strong appetite for collective progress in this industry. And that is why we're also doing this white paper and why we're running the session today, because we want to share this information and start building an understanding where there's actually a need and desire in the industry to get involved in collective progress for understanding regulation. So what I'd ask you to do next is, firstly, we'll be making this report available to download from our website. It contains a lot more information and a lot more detail. So I'd encourage you to download that and share that internally. Have a look at the recommendations we're making. Identify people internally who would maybe be involved in that, and have a discussion with them about how you're going to be investing in the future of managing regulations in your business. Is it a mixture of internal or collective action? And then we will be sending out a survey in the next few weeks to understand the industry position on whether there's a need for a collective action.
And I think, Andy, you've really underplayed it about how what we've shared with you is just the top line of insights that we've discovered. There is so much more to see in the report we're publishing tomorrow. And with compliance already being part of most RFPs and pitches, and regulations continuing to evolve concurrently across every market, investing more in being prepared for current and coming regulations will really strengthen both how your company manages risk and how you're perceived by the clients and partners that you work with. And there are two options here. So whether you choose to develop your legal and policy expertise internally and participate in formal feedback independently and create the sort of custom guidelines for your teams on your own, or whether you choose to support being able to do all of these things through collective industry engagement. For example, so we as the IAB would bring on that legal and policy expertise, who would then work with all of our members to create the guidelines and be able to submit formal feedback on behalf of all of our members. Either way, the industry will have a much more representative voice informing how regulations being developed and how companies can better prepare for them.
So I think thank you for that, Miranda. I think we've now finished for today. I think the only thing left to say is to thank you for joining and listening to our webinar. If you have any questions about what we've done or interested in doing any of this kind of research yourself to help the industry learn and progress, then please reach out to myself with the details here. So again, thank you for your time, and we hope you have learned something and now love regulation.